I think it's a good idea to proceed on to something a little less technical in some ways and a little more intuitive, because in fact the way I approach knowledge is as an idea, as something we experience and have. It's a real property, not just something that's just a word people made up with no real meaning. Somebody knows something. I mean, I think we all agree that somebody knows something. This is not a fantasy people have. This is not a delusion, because if you claimed that, you'd have to claim that you knew that, and that we've already shown that this pattern of self-destructive, pernicious, sort of pseudo skepticism about things that really deep down we all take for granted in a certain way, and is really ridiculous, especially when you look at how, in order to attempt to mount a contrary position, the position attacked must be used as a sort of hidden premise in the argument. So it's not doubted that there's some intuition involved, because intuition just means an inner knowing, really. Intuition means to know as if you taught yourself, to know as if the teacher were within you. What intuition's really saying is the inborn subjective part of knowledge, the inborn and naturally inherent part of knowledge that's not based on circumstances as much as it's based on the condition of the person having the knowledge. It's a very key property of knowledge, which inevitably unites the individual with the universal in a way that is so fundamental that it turns out to explain in part how it's possible to go, how it's possible for an individual to go from instances to a generality in their thinking. And that also explains how it's possible for someone to make a judgment in a situation about what needs to be done, including what they need to believe is the case, and then what needs to be done. It's like a condition of life that's like that show 24 Hours or 24 or whatever it was called, but all the time there's a function of consciousness that's always appraising and assessing situations so as to make something of them in time sufficient for making effective decisions on an extreme, where on one extreme or another or anything in between. Sometimes you've got an hour to think of a chess move. Sometimes you're playing a 5-minute game of chess. But basically, the idea is that there's a subjective component which is inherent, innate, and probably in essence what knowledge is as we experience it. It's always a part of that. It's the quality of knowledge. So I'm going to do some diagramming here to keep the picture constant. So basically, there are things in the universe. There are properties, and properties may be of things, or things may manifest from properties. Like there's a property called color, and as a general feature of experience, and rather there is a property in general, but it specifically manifests as certain qualia that we experience. So there's a quality in the experience that's more objective, that things have color, and then there's the qualia in our consciousness that tells us what color is like. So there's whatever there is in, say, my hat right now that gives it the property, the quality specifically of being red. And that property corresponds to my inherent capacity to see red as red and not something else, not blue, not yellow, by any other name, even red. I see red when I say red, I see this color, whatever this color is, and you see the color you see, even if we both call it the same word and see different colors. We consistently see what we see, and we don't see something else. Not at that point, not at any point where that happens. And that's the intuitive part, the part that's inherent to us, integrating and interacting with in a relationship of correspondence to a property out there, so to speak, in the world, on the objective end of our experience, a field of experience. So let's say that there are qualities, and then let's take a special term for qualia, and I'm not really sure what the best term for qualia would be. Let us not use Q, because we like to, little q, because we like to use that for propositions, but I think there is something rather elegant about the qualia of experience. There's something inherently novel and wonderful about this aspect of consciousness. And I feel that if that's true, then we should derive it last from the other features of experience, which together work together to create this kind of network of features that add up to an experience. So let's say that there's also a lowercase version of that, which I'm right now want to go with. Sort of want to go with lambda abstractly, but so we'll make what we'll do is we'll make a special lowercase q, and I'm going to make it look like, see, because paragraph would be that, isn't it? I should probably even just modify it in a way that's I know that the heuristic methodology is going to bear out some novel features that might even make these notions reversible. And my overall sense of how it works is that in fact there is a reversibility to it, because inversions wouldn't even be possible if there weren't such reversible aspects of fundamental qualities like the experience of good and evil. Status quo and norms and mores can distort the sense of what is to be praised and what is to be blamed. For example, people develop hardened senses of guilt and shame, or pride and exhilaration about things that may not be at all what they should. So we'll start now, though, with the quality being preeminent, and the qualia. In this case, a given qualia would be a given unit of qualia would be a quale, but we're going to just say qualia in the plural and singular. So when we have these aspects of experience, that's a sort of content, because you can't really, no matter what you can say about red, no matter how you can, or good, or the sense of knowingness that that might be expressed as truth or veritas, these are kind of, they don't necessarily have a form in themselves, even if they're always with a form. And even if there's a formal way to represent them. In fact, that's what experience is, a formal way of representing the contents of experience, the forms of experience. But if we're talking about a relationship of form and content, let qualities and qualia be the content. The form would be represented in conditions of experience that they're independent of the individual experiencing them. They might be contents too, but functionally, in relation to the experience of the subject, they are formal. Anything could have substituted, and not in every case, but generally there's that sense. So we have situations, circumstances, conditions of the world that help modify that objectively. So we're going to say, for example, there may be quantitative aspects or dimensions, properties, as it were. So we'll, but not in the sense of propositions. We might even just go ahead and, I'm going to reverse it. I'm going to say there are properties that go with the qualia, and what goes with the qualities would be some aspect of quantity, which could be called like a characteristic or a dimension. And I don't want to say quantity per se, because quantity is really a quality if you think about it. But formally, we would say there's a dimension of qualities expressed as a kind of characteristic. So let us say characteristic, capital C, and in fact, let us ennoble it a little bit with a, that doesn't look like something it's not. And in this relationship, we generally have two features, which I will polarize as subject, which I want to say is active, and I want to say that because it's alive in the person independently of most objects. That should be object. Object is more a thing with respect to the active experience. See, more passive thing. So we're going to say subject is active. And we're going to say that the object is passive and blue, so to speak. And these are going to relate in some kind of relationship. There's a relation. If the relation is true, if the relation, I shouldn't use that. That's a specific relation, cross product. Let's go ahead and just make it very abstract. Relation. Even though some relations use that same symbol, this could represent a relation in general, an operation of some kind obtains between them. There are other ways, but this is the one that I think helps things stay clear. And these aspects can overlap or invert in certain ways, and there's nothing wrong with that feature. That there's nothing about it that stops us from using absolute terms and fixing them concretely. So basically, experience is this array of subject and object, and I'm taking this where it should go. There it is. Yep. So we're looking at a relationship that is between consciousness and what we call reality. And this relationship of consciousness and reality is somewhat it's construed in a somewhat arbitrary way by people, and sometimes some will say that reality just is consciousness. But I would say consciousness always has objective features that have to be related to subjective features. You don't think everything is just how you feel on the inside. You think things have a certain independence. As Descartes tells us, there's an adventitious aspect to experience that seems to originate from another cause than ourselves. And that's sort of more what reality is grounded by in worlds or contexts, like, for example, societies, natural environments, conditions of the body, whatever. The consciousness has a transcendental aspect with relation to this reality, but not one that needs to be considered unreal or less real than reality, because we're talking about reality in a contextual way. Of course, in the metaphysics of mind that I employ, really all of reality is consciousness. So, in fact, looking at reality in a more, let's just say, in a way that's biased correctly, I would say, because there's no reality without consciousness. Turns out that Bishop Berkeley was right about that. We have a relationship of experience. Experience could be considered a kind of special knowing of reality. Let us say that in order to, if X, let's take a proposition out of this before going further with that. The proposition will be, let's close that off there, that if X has a proper relationship to reality that we might call a true, let us say, direct and coherent relationship to it that is sort of greater than knowledge that you're conscious of. It's not just what you're conscious of. It's a whole relationship of the conscious being. Even parts that are not considered abstract, conceptual, reflective, or whatever. So we are accounting for intuition, perception, sensation, everything. In relation to this larger context of reality of some kind, or specific domain of reality. It's a little, let's get that clear. That starts to look like it. Starts to look like, okay. Oh, that looks horrible. Looks better when I make those closer together and make those plain. And then X has, let's just say there's some mind X that has this kind of fundamental, I want to say harmony, coherence with context of reality, which is this such that if that's true, then there is a knowledge of a certain feature of experience that is, let us just say, made possible for awareness. It's like it's possible to be aware of this more explicitly. It's not necessarily the case. And I'm going to represent that one by a little Greek letter called epsilon. So if that's the case, then X knows at least potentially, that there is some relationship of subject and object, some kind. That should be around like that. So, and this is going to be key, because the structuring of claiming how we can go from just empirical evidence in our experience to a general idea, and vice versa, to be able to know that something is the case just from ideas alone, without having to have some exact little piece of evidence that I can take and put in front of somebody else and say, see, now you have to believe me. There has to be a way that intuition can be correct without being verified by a third party, basically. And I'm sort of giving this room here to happen inside one mind, and therefore possibly across minds if they're in harmony. If somebody's trying to blow you off, no matter what you say, you're not going to be able to convince them that something's going on. They're not going to believe you unless they share a certain fundamental relationship to reality, which makes it something they're willing or possibly even able to know explicitly. And even this is going to take some work in a lot of cases. It doesn't have to mean they're going to have to do this to act, and it doesn't mean they're going to have to do this to know. It just means if it's going to get more explicit, basically your epistemology grows out of here. The refinement and further explication of that feature of, let us just say, reality. This reality here. And there's realities of different sorts. So, in fact, this will probably be distinguished from this in some way. But they're isomorphic. It's like the same thing, just maybe looked at on a different side or at a different angle or with a different emphasis. In the case where this obtains, this is more like the epistemology. And I'll just go ahead and write epistemology there. The epistemology is it's a structural approach that enhances, let's call this a kind of understanding, really, or I don't want to say understanding, a coherence with reality, a kind of harmony, an integrity of mind that is only possible when there is a relationship to reality that enables a fundamental kind of knowledge about experience, which relates subjective qualia with objective characteristics, subjective qualities with objective properties. So, or the domain. So basically, you get a kind of cross product that would happen in that case, and I should use this here for that. So basically, it gets a little thorny, but I think this is intuitive. And that can include that as well. And there is always a range of relations that are from the general to the particular, and from the transcendental to the immanent, which we'll have to represent with perhaps something make it too complicated, but let's just indicate that there's relations going this way and this way. There's transcendence, and there's an immanentization, or the making of manifestation, or immanentization of something that is more general and not particular. And there are aspects of the mind which reflect all of those features. And so really, in a way, we could think of the mind as the totality of these things, and reality as the totality of these things. But ultimate reality is best described as a mind. And so really, mentality is what exists. And when mentality is real, when it's real mentality, it entails a consciousness relationship to circumstances of a world, a sort of world condition that will enable us to say that it's true, that in proportion as this is true, we can imply that there is this relationship, a kind of sound and valid relationship of elements that constitutes a mind. And the mind, being the most fundamental feature of reality, the mind is definitely what is most fundamental. And when we take a mind as the most fundamental feature of reality, which I've already explained, that I have my reasons for that, but they're not too lengthily involved, but in truth, reality is minds and minds within minds. The relations over here and relations between them are reflective of a mind in its organization level, its orderliness. We could say that this includes. We could say over here is the mentality, really. And it could consist of an epistemic form or a formal part, an epistemic aspect over here, and over here is a more let us just say it is a sort of axiological and at the same time ontological aspect. But basically, to exist is not neutral. It is good. And to have one's existence threatened is evil. So, fundamentally, goodness and evil are primitive qualities of the notion of what is real in ontology. So, for sure, I would place ontology as the overall condition, and the ontology or and the epistemic, and really the metaphysics of their relation is a form of epistemology. So really, metaphysics is a form of knowledge, and it's a question of how we know reality, especially its ontology. So really, metaphysics and epistemology would both go here. We might even say metaphysical epistemology. Metaphysical epistemology. Metaphysical epistemology and over here we have, I would say, an axiological ontology, because ontology is relative to a functional activity taking place on top of it, but it drives the value of these operations, which simply serve to reflect and sort of relate in a recapitulating feedback sort of loop with the sort of the being as such. But this is really just sort of a formal distinction. This isn't like a thing per se. This is just saying that of these two varieties of mentality, which are philosophical in nature, philosophic mentality, it's a question of knowing. To know yourself and to know your world in a way that is sincere and qualitatively genuine in the content, but is formally capable of being formally complex and well structured as needed, ideally, in circumstances that best befit when that should occur, or demand that it should occur. And the relation here is also not airtight, watertight as in these others. It can shift according to context, but in this case, the context is that the metaphysical epistemology and the axiological ontology are very tightly related in a kind of, as we conceive them in certain ways and as we practice them in other ways. But if they were propositionally related, we can say in one context for sure, in a very general context, that when X has a kind of fundamental, coherent, let's just say, grasp or comprehension, in some sense, of a realm of reality. This might be called a world. This might better be called a realm, which I think a straight R would be fine. And basically, with a sort of macrocosmic sense of our reality here and a microcosmic sense here in terms of a realm, domain-range relationship is implied, which is really true because this is sort of a domain of archetypal elements that feeds the raw material for a range of their, this is a functional relation, really. This is more than just a dividing line. This is almost an operation. It's a function relating these as archetype and instance, as it were, or an articulation of a fundamental, or a manifestation of a principle, and so forth. The idea being that this, in the person, recapitulates something fundamental about the cosmos. Now, this all looks nice as far as a sort of skeletal structure of what it's like to be a mind with a mentality in a cosmos. But the relation of a microcosmos, which would be the symbol for cosmos, and I'm going to represent a cosmos with omega because it implies a whole which is going somewhere. It has a goal, omega. And by the way, also omega represents, in another context, a certain substantive content in a being. And that is an omega, but it's a microcosmos. And so it looks like a U, an extra long back. And of course, the macrocosmos relation would be over here, and that would be also this relation, but it would be with a capital M, macro, the Greek capital. And their relationship is obscured by a serious problem, which we call the problem of evil. It's a very serious problem. And it's not going away just because people wish it away or deny it away and try to run away from reality. It's
horrible, but there it is. We'll use red because that's red. So let's just use black then. And I'm going to put a term in between that is ambivalent to each. Best way to represent that would be to put two ambivalencies with one term in the middle. The best term for evil, I'm going to have to say, is a Greek symbol called xi. And it would be, so since it's fundamental, I would put it in the form of a capital Xi. These are Greek letters used just to represent these, not using words and paragraphs and stuff. And basically it's ambivalent to both of these. The ambivalencies are not necessarily defined in relation to each other, but ambivalencies have two forms: extremes and an intermediate zone. Evil wishes to stay in the intermediate zone. It wishes to prolong the conflict between itself and its victims. It wishes to be as subtle as possible for as long as possible in order to get the most rewards, but it wishes the power to be brutal and crude whenever necessary, all within the range of maintaining this potentially forever, this kind of scam that it's running. I hate to bring up evil in this beautiful context of purity, but that's the whole point, really. And of course, I symbolize ambivalence with a particular operator, which is, we'll use this for operations for a while. In fact, I will use it for that too, just to, I'll reserve it for special operations in special contexts. This operator of ambivalence, let us say, is in its final form here, and it manifests in its, let us say for us, in a form that is as if it had been going on for a while and may never end. That's how evil would like it. And it acts as a sort of, they're 90 degrees to each other. It's either, there are two kinds of ambivalence, one like this and one like this. And the idea is that there's an amount of time in which conflict occurs between good and evil, and it's fixed by whether or not good and evil are sufficiently separated. And they begin imperfectly but completely separated. Imperfectly because there's a chance that they'll mix for the first time in eternity. And then they do at some point, and that's defined as this beginning right here. Rather, a version of this. A version of this at the beginning. It's like a vesica piscis or a fisheye. I'll diagram that later. And it starts off with a position of a subtle kind of ambivalence, which is invisible almost, until it finally happens in the first, whatever the cause of evil is, happens. And it starts off subtle with deception. It prolongs to ensure, it has a difficult beginning and it doesn't want to lose its precious chance to commit evil acts. It's very patient. And this will have a form that victimizes, really, the microcosmic beings. But it cannot do direct harm to the macrocosmos, except through what it does to the microcosmos and what it has been doing. What can bring about the finality of that in ultimate terms is a relation between the micro and the macro, where together they manifest a trait that they hold in common ambivalently against the evil realm context that they're in and the world situation. And they're able to work together to sort of
squeeze out a separation, a final separation. And at first, and at this point, it is permanently impossible for it to occur again, because all that can be learned from what had happened before evil occurred was enhanced by everything that happened after it occurred, to the point that it ceased to occur again against the grain of the force which initiated it, which means it was more equal to and greater than that force, so that it could be bottled back up permanently and effectively annihilated. It doesn't matter for us what happens to it on the other side. That's a privilege that real reality has. Don't have to worry about fakes. It's got the monopoly on substance. But it takes time, and that is a key feature of this whole process, which is, on the one hand, in favor of evil, in some narrow sense, because it has time to cause suffering, it has time to trick people, it has time to create bad circumstances. And on the other hand, it can't go too far. Basically, evil wants to keep. Yeah, I would say I should maintain that. It wants to have a relationship that's greater than or equal to this this point right here, which is not the midpoint per se, but comes very close to it. In fact, I would have to say it actually is the midpoint. That's the only consistent way to interpret it. This midpoint must not be surpassed. Even if it's reached, it must not be. It's a gap that must not be crossed. Basically, once the first one, let's say, this was evil's privilege right here to start the process, and this will be the first. It has a kind of alpha aspect to it. It has the appearance of power. It already had a context of existence which previously existed. It inserts itself in the middle as a kind of middleman, a kind of thief. Whereas the macrocosmos, once unified with the micro properly, seals that, and that is more their calling there. But in fact, because of the nature of being immanent, because of the nature of being really of God, really divine, really alive, really conscious, really having experiences, really possessing and employing a mentality, because of really having these characteristics, properties, because of the life of these qualities and qualia in the whole situation, but especially as characterized by the general and the particular, the macro and the microcosmoi of mind, which are good, by the way. I'll just throw that in there. It's actually good to be real and exist and have processes and experiences and time and all these things. But when evil initiates this action, it has a sort of artificial initiative that's it's godlike in a sense. That's the power that even the most conservative Christians, a certain Protestant, and even Catholic stripes will say the devil has. It's been granted to him, as it were. For what purpose, they cannot possibly explain, and I have issues with them on that. But basically, once this is reached, this is the bridge that must be crossed by the righteous in order to get past the gulf that evil has artificially created. Once they have initiated this process themselves, and they complete it,
then they overcome this artificial and lesser one, which I will, and this will become relevant later. This isn't spurious, by the way. By the way, none of this is spurious, I should say, because it might appear so, but I'm just being careful. I move much slower when I'm doing it the first time, when I'm working it the first time. Basically, all this will tie in later to other ideas. All these are based on previous ideas, and all these relations can be further articulated and demonstrated in more detail, and will be. When I started philosophy, it was for the purpose of basically making sense of the world in which I lived. And in the process of doing that, I noticed there was a tradition of this, and I noticed there were some strange problems that this tradition had in the world, along with problems the world had in itself. And it seemed that both this tradition of philosophy and the world's customs, cultures, and paradigms and so forth could not account for these problems, including the problem of evil, but and many other problems, all of which I can account for. I can I can literally account for them empirically with the evidence in the world, and logically with a metaphysical structure that articulates how I know and why it's proper to know in a certain way and what's proper to be done about it, and also the knowledge of what is proper generally, and all these things can be determined systematically and logically, but also the facts of the world will support it and of experience. All these terms which I use in this context, which could be called a paradigm, it could be called a system of ideas integrated toward a common purpose, which does not necessarily constrain them to only operate this way as well. This is not a bound. These symbols are not bound to these strict interpretations, but this is how they're being used now, and it's very and in this context of their use, they form a sort of mindset, a mentality which structures intuitions we have about what's going on in the world. And in trying to do this early on, just to be frank with you, I'm no spring chicken. So I've been doing this for a while, and I've gone to the university, I've studied there, I've read voluminously before, during, and after university. I did this work without even knowing it when I was a child. I was working on these ideas as a child. I didn't know, but I was stimulated by the discussions and contents of family activity, which sometimes touched on these subjects in some way. And my own experiences were quite traumatic in life, so I had to make sense out of them. And at the same time, there were many astounding qualities of experience that needed to be integrated into one understanding. So working on it, I finally reached a point where the work that I had done, learning from others, and including experiences from the world, started to take a back seat to my own constructive approach, which to me makes the best use of them. So none of this is an exercise, in futility. It's all going somewhere. None of it is an exercise in vanity. It all came from somewhere, and it's a summation of something that's been done. And at the same time, it is not a. It is. It's being done with a structure that I think is self-evident. And it's going to become more so, though, as we go along. If you've seen what I've done before and you see what I'm doing now, you can see that there's a structure that keeps on, there's a thread that keeps going through it. There's not really fundamentally new things going on here. There's just new ways of dealing with the fundamentals that I had already addressed that haven't shown, or in some cases even done before. I'm always learning, I'm always growing. This isn't a finished product. Knowledge doesn't work that way in this context, in this world. And fortunately, I'm someone who's never claimed that, unlike some. not going to name names, or they claim it's impossible. I'm not going to agree with either of those people. I'm not omniscient in the sense that some people claim, and I'm not fundamentally incapable of knowing anything the way other people, the way they talk, it implies. I understand it's a process, and a process has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we're somewhere between those two right now, in the world and in each of ourselves, on the whole. Some part of us is already completed in whatever form we're going to end up in, and that's leading and drawing all the rest toward itself, like a force of gravity, and that's the final cause. Final is what omega represents. But in this case, I allow it to represent the whole too, because if you think of the whole as what's the summation of all the parts, there's a finality to it only when all those parts are summed together. And all their relations are factored. So we see that there's these ambivalencies that have developed. And further, we could even differentiate a couple of them quite well. Namely that in the ultimate sense, this is completed by the totality of the divine being finally separating and going against the nature of evil. And at the same time, this initiation was an insinuation into, by evil, was an insinuation into a realm that pre-existed. And it will be shut back out in just this way. And when that's completed, in chemistry it's called a Hess diagram. If there were a Hess diagram for this, the formula would show that there is a net increase in the value and condition and health, as it were, of reality as a whole, including divine consciousness at its greatest, in the sense that as a whole, which includes God at the highest level, there is a total improvement, because there's no going back. Just like when this started, just like when evil started. I explained this in other videos too, by the way. Now some of this is very not radically new. So I just to inform new viewers and perhaps some former viewers that this is not spurious at all. It may appear that way sometimes, and I can't blame you for having that impression time to time. But if I didn't know better, I would. But I know that the spurious beginning of evil, as it has been called, the initiation of it in this way, is against the grain of the totality of a reality that nevertheless did not prevent this initiation of evil. I don't care what anyone says or believes, it is not true that evil was prevented, and therefore it might have been unpreventable, or it might have been desired. But it cannot be true that it was preventable and not desired, because it was not prevented. It might be unpreventable and undesired. We say that it is. And Gnostics are the only ones that say that it is, and the only ones who have ever said that it is. I say Gnostics in a general sense. I don't mean the specific group called Gnostics in the Near East, per se. Anyone who holds these theological positions, has something in common with the people called Gnostic that's so fundamental, but is so particularly clearly developed in Gnostic, so-called Gnostic theologies, that it attained this kind of distinction that was bundled together. It was not just one idea, but several ideas bundled together under the name to know, because to know these things is a fundamental aspect, and the way I mean knowledge is different than the way some people do. It's larger and more powerful and more specific in a lot of cases. It gives the power to complete this process for the good. When we can clearly understand good from evil, to put it plainly, and to go back to some archaic references in history, when you properly bite of that fruit, you basically dispel an inner evil that evil implants within, and I'll show how that works symbolically. And then working together with what I call heaven and all other divine beings, immanent and transcendent, there's a final separation that forces evil back into its position, but in the equal and opposite direction of force. And we're talking about scales of magnitude that are beyond infinite here. So the force is, there's no coming back out of that. Whatever that is, you're there for eternity. You're put there. And it was in a place of some kind for an eternity before it manifested. It would have been better if it stayed there, though. Because it ain't going there to go into some kind of permanent vacation. It's going to be unpleasant when it's put back there. It's going to pay back everything that it cost. And the inverse of that will be a return with interest of everything that was taken. That interest will be partly invested in ensuring that this never happens again. This transaction was not wanted. It's criminal. It's the essence of crime. So as this unfolds, the evil force, C, is eliminated. We're coming up on an hour, so I don't want to belabor it any further in one sitting. Well, basically, generally speaking, this is the arrangement of the cosmoi, which I've referred to in various contexts before: the microcosmos, the macrocosmos, and the supermacrocosmos. And evil dwells in the macrocosmos of our realm and inserts itself as an artificial macrocosmos. But beyond that artificial macrocosmos is the real macrocosmos. So I call it the super macrocosmos because it's above, it's superior to the super means above, superior, superior to the pseudo macrocosmos. That we could just, better yet, reinterpret it. But everybody calls this the macrocosmos, the macrocosm, the whole, the universe, etc., as if this were this, the origin, the original reality. It's not. So I sometimes use the term, we should call it the pseudo macrocosmos. The pseudo macro, the micro, there's also a pseudo micro. It depends on the situation. That's all going to be articulated in terms common to the ones we've used here. But basically how that functions as a set of ideas guiding our understanding of how the mind is an array of expressions that are templatively constructive of manifestations of that mind into various mentalities, all of which would have been life. In fact, really, in essence, life is the life of the mind. Life is a mentality, an approach to existence that a mind has. It is a series of experiences that unfold in ways that one reflects upon and gains meaning from, and so on and so forth. And this could carry on into infinity, and does. And we've noticed that all evil is ever is an interference with this process, a destruction of this process, an inhibition, a parasitic and predatorial relationship to this process that has to be ended. There's no negotiating with it. There's ending it. And it's not going to negotiate in the end except by being ended. That's the truth. And that this whole process also happens to overlap with what I say is the real project of philosophy, the real project of religion, and the real project of the world, and the real project of ultimate reality, and the divine project. The divine project, which is the real great work. The great work wasn't to initiate evil, cause so much misery, claim the credit for both the cause and the solution, that's Hegelian dialectics of abuse that we know in this world is perpetrated by evil beings. Now, quite the contrary. The great work had already been going on. There was an interruption, and it would have kept going on just fine. There was no need to go through this to have a greater. That was not necessary. But it did happen, and we're going to take it, and we're going to go beyond it. And beyond even what was before. Just as this initiated a beyond what was before, will uninitiate it and transcend it completely. That's the great work of the ages, beyond the ages. Great work of the ages is an evil work. This is beyond the ages.